Hello, my name is Tim Malone, and I'm doing a series of lectures on American history. And today we're going to talk about the War of 1812. Not surprisingly, you'll discover that I have a bit of a revisionist view of the War of 1812. The War of 1812. I think that the revisions that I back are pretty much commonly taught now. When I was in high school and college years ago, the war was explained primarily as a reaction against the British tampering with our shipping in the Atlantic Ocean. It was a battle for freedom of the seas, a high principle, right? The young republic defending the principle for all of freedom of the seas. What's interesting about that explanation for the war is that it owes a lot to World War I. When Woodrow Wilson led the United States into that World War I, which we had no business getting into, we'll talk about that when we get to World War I. World War I, very much mistaught, in my opinion. World War I, Wilson, in trying to justify leading us into that war, brought up the freedom of the seas and hearkened back to the War of 1812. This isn't the first time the United States was going to fight for freedom of the seas. And in 1917, when we entered World War I, the basic structure of how American history was going to be taught was being formed. The first classes in American history on the college level were being formed during that period. And so because of World War I, you get this War of 1812 was about freedom of the seas. Well, it was a bit, but not primarily. The War of 1812 was primarily about the West. And what's the West in 1812? It's the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. That piece of ground we've talked about several times so far. That was given to us by the British at the Peace Treaty, Treaty of Paris, 1783. The West. And Canada, because of course, as a result of the American Revolutionary Agreement, the Peace Treaty, the British remained in Canada. The British remained in the St. Lawrence Seaway and the northern shores of the Great Lakes. Because according to the Peace Treaty in 1783 that ended the American Revolutionary War and that recognized the United States as a new nation, that Peace Treaty had split the Great Lakes. Yes, lines right down the middle of 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. And it's that way to this day, of course. The Great Lakes are split between the United States and Canada. Well, of course, because we have such friendly relations with Canada, it's no big deal. But when you're still in some ways at war, like we were with England after the Revolution, even though England recognized our existence, remember we talked about the fact that the next 30 years, up until the end of the War of 1812, the United States and England are going to be at each other's throats, are going to be competitors, and the English barring American shipping from all English ports. I mean, even though they recognized the new nation, the English continue to wage economic war on the new nation. It creates trouble. Well, it's going to lead to war, War of 1812. So the British are still in Canada. There's this ill-defined border, and the Great Lakes are kind of an entity. And so the war was about the West, Canada, the Great Lakes. Another point, the war was very much about Native Americans. This is another aspect of the war that over the years, well, for a while, before the Civil Rights Movement, before the Native American Rights Movement, was downplayed. The British in Canada had been tampering with our Indians. That's how the government in Washington put it. Because the Native Americans in the Great Lakes region, Ohio Valley, those Native Americans had fought with the British in the Revolutionary War and had continued to favor the British after the war. And the British continued to trade with and have sort of diplomatic relations with Native American tribes that are technically in the United States. The Potawatomi Confederation. The Potawatomi Confederation is very powerful Native American confederation. And it's going to take the new government, the new United States government, several decades and several humiliating military defeats to defeat the Potawatomi Confederation. And the Potawatomi Confederation preferred the English. They preferred the English. They considered themselves patrons of the English in Canada, right there, right across the river from Detroit. So the war was about the West, Canada, and Native Americans. It was not so much about freedom of the seas, although that's what's come down to us for various reasons. Here's another important point about the War of 1812. The United States declared war on England. We started it. We started it. And our declaration of war, June 19th, 1812, caught the British by surprise. Relations had been improving somewhat on the margins, and then the United States, sort of out of the blue, declares war on England. It was the climax of nearly 3 decades of troubled relations between the two countries. It caught the government of Great Britain unawares and was seen by many Americans as doubtful policy. No kidding, right? No kidding. We started it. And what was the war in? What was James Madison, President of the United States? Right? He'd succeeded Jefferson 2 terms. Then in 1808, Madison, Jefferson's Secretary of State and fellow Virginian, was elected president. Now, this is during a period where the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson's party that he and Madison had founded in their quarrel with Hamilton in the 1790s, the Democratic Republican Party of Jefferson and Madison dominates national politics. The Federalists were never much of an organized political party, and what was left of them was in decline. The Democratic Republicans had veto-proof majorities in both houses. Madison could get anything passed he wanted. He had overwhelming majorities in Congress. But still, the vote to go to war with England was close. There were a number of Democratic Republican defections. It was seen by many Americans as doubtful policy. It was not that there was no cause for war, but that the U.S., after so deliberately having avoided war in the past, should now abandon that policy and turn to war. In other words, the English and the French in this long struggle, right now in 1812 in the Napoleonic phase of the 123-year war between England and France for world domination. In 1812, the Napoleonic Wars were raging in Europe. England was, of course, the primary enemy of Napoleon, right? So both England and the United States had maintained its neutrality as both French and English ships preyed on American shipping. And remember, during the Revolution, during the entire history of the United States, we've been a commercial country. We've been a trading country. We've been a seafaring country. There were American ships before we even became the United States, when we were colonies, ships built in the colonies in every port in the world. It was a huge industry in the United States, shipbuilding, sailing vessels, crews, merchants, agents. It was a huge industry. and we'd avoided war, kind of humiliatingly. And now Madison, in June of 1812, sort of war. Now, there's still controversy to this day about what Madison was thinking. Even though he wrote about it, he lived into the 1820s, James Madison. Even though he wrote about it, it's kind of political rhetoric that Madison writes after the war, about the war. Not very convincing, not, kind of mamby-pamby kind of stuff about what he was thinking. War with Great Britain. Now, again, Jefferson, when his 8 years, the wars in Europe, preying on, France and England preying on our shipping. His, as we discussed in last lecture, his solution was the embargo of 1807. The embargo, in other words, Jefferson had Congress, which again, Jefferson had huge majorities in Congress. He could get anything he wanted passed. He had huge majorities in Congress. Voted for an embargo, which was all American ships were to be tied up. I mean, it's breathtaking in its audacity, the embargo of 1807. But Jefferson said anything rather than war. And Jefferson had an exaggerated notion of the influence of American trade on Britain and France. Jefferson thought, well, I'll just stop all trade and they'll have to seek peace. Neither one of them will be able to continue this war without American resources. And there was something to that view. It turned out to be wrong, all right? I mean, Jefferson exaggerated the economic power of the United States. The embargo, in fact, in Madison, the failure of the embargo, and, you look at the United States, the smuggling went through the roof, right? So the embargo failed. Jefferson had Congress rescind it like the month before Madison becomes president. They rescind the embargo, give the new president a break. Highly unpopular, especially in New England, the main trading area and the main residual area that the Federalists still had power in, New England. They had vehemently opposed the embargo, and many of them had engaged in smuggling. Through where? Through Canada. Through Canada, the British. The aim of the war, according to Madison, what historians say now is Madison wanted the United States to conquer and annex Canada. The war aim was the conquest of Canada, the elimination of the English presence in North America. Just like after the French and Indian War, the English had kicked the French out of Canada, Madison wanted to kick the English out of Canada. Oh, it's just a joke, all right? But I always say, conquering Canada. Oh, it still has an appeal. Madison thought that thinking geopolitically, right, that the United States' hold on the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes, area south of the Great Lakes, was going to be precarious as long as the British were in Canada. What's the solution? Get the British out of Canada. This was an aggressive step by Madison. This was an aggressive war. We picked a fight. We wanted to conquer Canada. The results, right? The war was a tie. When the war ended in 1815, nothing had changed. Basically, nothing had changed. In terms of the map, in terms of where each side was. I guess, the war went very poorly for the United States. That's another aspect of the war that's stressed in textbooks, is how incompetently it was fought. And understand that the new Constitution, remember the document written in the room in Philadelphia in 1787, was meant to create a stronger central government? because the Articles of Confederation were weak and the new Constitution was strong. Remember that? Well, this was the first war. War of 1812 was the first war fought under the new Constitution, and the war was an abysmal failure. If the idea of the Constitution was to create a state that could successfully make war, the first war, War of 1812, the Constitution came up short. The war was insufficiently fought, incompetently fought from the American side. At the time of the declaration of war, the U.S. had 6,000 regular troops and 16 naval vessels. Great Britain had over 600 ships and an active duty regular army of 250,000. And they'd been at war with France on and off for 30 years, mostly on. They were a war state, Great Britain. Obviously the most preponderant navy in the world. And we declared war on them. Now, what the hell was Madison thinking? He knew these numbers. What was he thinking? Well, I think primarily he's thinking England is in a death grip struggle with France, with Napoleon in 1812. By June 19th, 1812, when we declared war, Napoleon's on his way to Moscow. And I guess Madison's thinking he's going to succeed in forcing Russia to heel, like he'd forced all the other states in Europe to heel. Of course, his invasion of Russia turns out to be a fiasco and the beginning of the end of Napoleon. I think President Madison was thinking, Napoleon's going to win this war for us. The goal of the war was to invade and occupy Canada. The United States declared war was the culmination of nearly 3 decades of troubled relations between the two countries. And when the war's over, status quo. The English are still in Canada. Let me emphasize this point again. The War of 1812 was poorly fought by the United States. Quote, the sheer ineptitude of the American war effort is what comes down to us. And that's from a book called Mr. Madison's War by J.C.A. Stagg, written in 1983. I'm going to take a lot from Stagg's book here, Mr. Madison's War, because that's what it was called, and it should be. Again, he could get anything past Congress he wanted. He decided for war, and there was war. And again, my understanding is that even now, what was Madison thinking? Because a lot of historians don't think that his post-presidency explanations of the war are pertinent. He's not coming clean, it seems. Washington was burned during the war. The British, once they were done with Napoleon in Europe, they turned their attention to the war with America. And of course, they had command of the seas, they had veteran army, and they could land anywhere they wanted. They landed and marched to Washington and burned, it's barely, just recently being built up, Washington, D.C., out of a swamp. They burned the White House. They burned the Capitol. Madison had to flee, get on a horse and run away. There's another aspect of the war. The war was very unpopular with the American people. I don't know, very unpopular. Again, Madison represented the Democratic Republican Party, which had a preponderance of support. But even a lot of Democratic Republicans didn't back the war. It was particularly unpopular in New England, the last stronghold of the Federalists, the commercial, financial, trading capital of the United States, New England. They had to put up with the embargo. Then they had to put up with this war. And of course, the New England colony, or states, border Canada. So Madison wants to invade and occupy Canada through a region of the country where the war is immensely unpopular. And Madison wants to fight the war, wants to invade Canada with New England state militias. He doesn't want to dramatically expand the regular army. He wants the governors who hate him, Federalist governments in New England states, to pony up their militias to invade and occupy Canada. Well, a couple of the governors, I don't remember exactly who, a couple of the governors, because we're talking about New Hampshire and Vermont and Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut. A couple of those governors, what they did in their refusal to marshal, to federalize their militias, it borders on treason, some historians have said. That there was real trouble between the Federalist governors in New England and Madison in Washington. Insubordination, you might call it. Now, of course, there's also the Hartford Convention in early 1814, where those same states sent delegates to Hartford, Connecticut, and talked about seceding from the Union. New England seceding from the Union because of Madison's policies of war, because of his efforts to force them to invade Canada. The Hartford Convention. Of course, in 1860 and 61, 11 southern states will secede from the Union. Civil War. Here's a precursor. Ironically, in the North. In the North. The Hartford Convention. The war was unpopular. By the end of the war, by 1815, the United States had done little more than survive some of the most dangerous threats that had yet been posed to its existence as a nation. That in itself was no mean achievement. I mean, we declared war, aggressive war, to invade and annex Canada, and by the end of the war, we'd barely hung on. We'd barely hung on. In 1812, despite the Constitution, the government of the U.S. was simply too small and too weak for such an ambitious task as the conquest of Canada. The Peace of Christmas Eve, 1814, as has often been noted, settled none of the questions that had disturbed Anglo-American relations before the war. Nothing was solved. The United States had hung on. Now, it's interesting who won the war. It's interesting that at the peace treaty table in Ghent, Belgium, the British walked in. Their first offer was to carve out an Indian state out of United States territory, including and around Detroit, Michigan, a rather large area in southeast Michigan and northwest Ohio and parts of Indiana. The British said, yeah, here's what we want. We want, and of course that state would be dependent upon British Canada. In other words, the British wanted to de facto take a rather large portion of the Old Northwest as a result of the War of 1812. Now, as negotiations went on, the British dropped that claim. Again, remember, the Native Americans in the south of the Great Lakes, the Potawatomi Confederation, had fought with the British in the War of 1812. That the British originally want to create a state for them and then back off that and, in effect, sell their Native American allies down the river once again. Well, it's kind of amazing betrayal by the British of their Native American allies. And of course, they leave them then to the mercies of this federal government, this United States government that the Native Americans had almost all fought against in the war. The result is predictable when you consider our history. After the war, the still persistent fear that the British would control the interior trade of the U.S. through the St. Lawrence River put impetus behind the construction of the Erie Canal. Here we go. Geography. This is geopolitics. This is geography. The history of the United States, especially the first half of it, is so geographic. It's so geographic. And the War of 1812 was about geopolitics. Because the Great Lakes, a huge area, and the areas around it, and very rich, it'll turn out to be very rich agriculturally and ultimately industrially. And that watershed drains through the St. Lawrence Seaway. And this is back in the era where waterways are it when it comes to transportation and settlement and economic development. Through British Canada, and we tried in the War of 1812 to take over the St. Lawrence River. Failed. Now what? We'll build our own waterway to the west. The Erie Canal started right after the War of 1812. 10 years, 1815 to 1825. New York City, Albany, Buffalo. We're going to create our own waterway, our own water link, bypassing the British in Canada. Changing the geopolitics. The Erie Canal changes the geopolitics and takes away one of the irritants of the relationship between England and Canada and the new country. It's an interesting idea, isn't it? The Erie Canal solves the problems between the United States and England? Well, partially. There's other things. There's other macro events. This is why I think the War of 1812 is so interesting, because it signals the end of an era. 1815 is not only in American history a date that should be more widely known, in my opinion, but of course it is a widely known date in world history or European history because it's the end of the 123-year war between France and England for dominance of the Atlantic, for dominance of the world. The English win. Now, of course, in 1815, people didn't know that was the end of that series of wars, but it was. 1815, Napoleon's defeated at Waterloo, and England is predominant. 1815, the end of the War of 1812, and a change in the geopolitical situation. The end of the War of 1812 coincided with the end of an era which brought about fundamental changes in the Atlantic economy. We talked about this Atlantic economy from Columbus all the way up to 1492 to 1815. And then there's some fundamental changes that sort of bring an end to the dominance of this Atlantic economy. First one we talked about was the Erie Canal. The second one, this is a great story, the sugar beet. Now we talked about the fact that this Atlantic economy, one of the chief resources, one of the chief legs of the triangular trade was the sugar islands, the Caribbean, Brazil. Sugar, silver, sugar, slaves, the Atlantic economy. Sugar. Well, during the Napoleonic Wars, England, of course, blockaded France. And France's islands and colonies in the Caribbean, their sugar-producing regions, were cut off from France. France couldn't get any sugar from the sugar islands. So Napoleon's a smart guy, right? I mean, let me pause here to say, I think Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most misunderstood characters in history. And if you ask the question, who liberated more people in the history of the world the most? Napoleon Bonaparte would be in the running. Even though he was an emperor, even though he was a militarist, right? I mean, he was a soldier's soldier, right? And you know how to a hammer everything looks like a nail. Well, Napoleon's solution to everything was war. That's not a good trait. But nevertheless, he was an agent of the French Revolution. And everywhere he went, and he went everywhere in Europe, serfdom fell. The end of feudalism, the end of serfdom in Germany and Poland and Austria and parts of Italy. I mean, not just France. Wherever the Napoleonic armies went, serfdom was done away with. I mean, millions of people. Serfdom's a type of bondage, a type of slavery. That was eliminated by the French when they showed up. Now, of course, we think of Napoleon as nasty, no good Nick, because he was the enemy of England, and England had, we took England's side, well, in just about everything. We still do. And so the English animus towards Napoleon has affected Americans' view of Napoleon, to this day, I might say. So the end of the Atlantic economy, what do I mean to that? Napoleon, being a smart guy, says, well, I can't get sugar from the sugar islands anymore. What am I going to do? Well, somehow he came upon this, well, there's this plant you can grow in Europe called the sugar beet. And Napoleon goes, grow sugar beets. He breaks the dependence of Europe on Caribbean and Brazilian sugar. You no longer have to bring your sugar across the Atlantic. You can grow your own sugar in Europe. So that leg, not that they still grow sugar in the sugar islands, don't get me wrong, but it was a blow to the dependence. It changed the geopolitics, the economic politics of the world. The end of Spanish rule in Mexico, Central America, and South America, emulating the American Revolution in the early 1800s, most of Latin America and South America free themselves from Spain. Again, the Spanish Empire by that time was decrepit, and they were a secondary or tertiary power by that point, after having their century of predominance right after the discovery of America. And that changes the dynamic because, of course, empires are restrictive. Empires, the Spanish Empire, you had to get licenses to trade. Now there's a couple of dozen countries, Central and South America, and it changes the economic dynamic fundamentally. The rise of the cotton trade, this has something to do with industrialization. We're going to talk about that next lecture, the beginning of industrialization. And the first textile factories are built in England in the 1770s and 1780s. And of course, at the time, you don't know, but it's the beginning of what we call the Industrial Revolution, which is fundamentally going to alter the way human beings live. I mean, it's going to fundamentally, I'm a kind of an Industrial Revolution guy in that, what's the most important thing that's ever happened to human beings? The Industrial Revolution. Now you're saying, oh, come on, Malone, come on. There's what they call the Urban Revolution, way back when the first cities show up. The Urban Revolution, and just before that, the Agricultural Revolution. Those are, okay. In the last 6,000 years, the Industrial Revolution. And that's beginning. That's beginning in England. But as we'll see, it quickly goes to the United States and France and the below countries and Western Germany. The factory system, if you want to think of it that way, and we'll talk more about this next lecture, is emulated rather quickly around the world. Well, in Northern Europe and Northern United States. What do they want? These textile factories? Cotton. There's a boom for cotton. And it turns out that the southern United States is perfect for growing cotton. And cotton is susceptible to gang slave labor, or so it seems. It pays to buy slaves to tend your cotton. And it's an ever expanding demand for cotton. the first industrial industry, cotton manufacturing, cloth, textiles, and the rise of the industrial way changes the dynamics of the Atlantic economy. Again, sugar's de-emphasized, the Spanish Empire is gone, all happening right around the same time. And it alters the dynamic between the United States and England. It takes a lot of the causes for conflict away. Well, not the least is the end of the wars, right? The end of the wars with France. England wins. I kind of like this idea that macro events, right? The introduction of the sugar beet in Europe changes history. The defeat in the War of 1812 leads the United States to build the Erie Canal and other canals to link the East Coast with the interior, with this hunk of land the United States got at the Treaty of Paris, part of which I'm sitting in right now, northern Illinois. Those things altered the playing field. And the animus, the first 30 years of American history, from July 4th, 1776 to 1815, the relationship between what was going to become the United States and England dominated the agenda. The United States, to a large degree, faced east towards Europe, as it always had up to that point. What happened in Europe was of the utmost importance to the colonies and then the new nation. After the War of 1812, because of these macro events, that emphasis changes. And as we're going to talk about in the next lecture, a lot of historians say symbolically, after the War of 1812, and because of these macro changes in the economy and the geopolitical outlook, the United States turns west. Turns and faces west to this vast region, which, in 1803, Jefferson doubles with the Louisiana Purchase. Now it's not just to the Mississippi River, now it's to the Rocky Mountains. A huge area. And not surprisingly, it's not surprising, right, that the nation's consciousness turns west. It's an interesting mix of events that brings about this change. And so to me, 1815 is a very important year, and it draws a line across the timeline. 1815. Now again, it's not a date that's emphasized in American history, right? But periodization, remember when we talked about history, we talked about periodization and how that's what historians do. And it's natural. It's the nature of the beast, history, to lop the past up into eras, periods, right? It aids in the understanding of the past, to periodize. Well, I have my own periodization, right? And in American history. And it's 1607, the founding of Jamestown, right? The first permanent English colony, to 1688, when these wars between France and England start. I call that the foundation period. 81 years, from 1607 to 1688, the foundation of the colonies. I think Georgia hadn't been formed yet by 1688. I think all the others had been. And then from 1689, the beginning of this 126-year war between England and France, which birthed our nation. From 1689 to 1815, the second period of American history. 1815 And I call that the struggle for empire. So there's the foundation period and the struggle for empire, which ends in 1815. A very important year in American history that most people don't recognize. Now, of course, I'm feeling really good right now because I just periodized American history. That's what historians do. And it's my own periodization. I never saw anybody periodize American history like this up till now. The foundation period and then the struggle for empire ending when? 1815 with the end of the War of 1812. And now it's a new era in American history. And I guess I'm going to generalize, like a lot of historians do, the new country, Europe recedes in importance. And we turn west. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. The next lecture will be on the westward movement in the United States.